cybersecurity, it's in the papers every day. Well, it was also here at IP Possibilities, and we're very honored here to have Jeff England with Silver Star Communications with us. You were on this panel, and one of the things that you've been involved with for a while now is the CISRIC group. If you can talk about that and your role in that.
Sure. In the beginning days, when President Obama had issued the executive order February of 2013 about voluntary adoption, as an organization we had a strong interest in participating in that. In some ways it was a bit of a perfect storm. In my previous employment I worked as the CFO of an IT cybersecurity audit firm, so I was at least generally aware of the risks and in particular how it would affect the telecommunications industry. So I had a personal interest in becoming involved as I began a new career in telecommunications. Initially we reached out as a participant in the draft copy to try and provide comments and feedback, and as we did that we became more involved in the actual framework itself and participated in NIST working groups, etc. We ended up having some of our technical folks as part of Silver Star Communications that participated in Working Group 4 and contributed very much in terms of the content of the deliverable of that working group. At a personal level, I participated in it, perhaps a little bit more high level. We believe organizationally that there's a balance between the technical competencies required to complete these tasks and executive visibility that can be provided as well. And so in addition to all the great information that came out of CISRIC Working Group 4, what we really tried to do is develop internal tools and models that could be used to provide visibility within our organization, and frankly that's probably a little bit more where my expertise and experience has lied, but clearly all of it came together in forming policies and procedures internally that we continue to use today.
Well, I want to talk to you for a moment about one of those tools, but before we do that, back to the high level, the executive level, clearly it had buy-in, but you talked about it being really almost part of your strategic objectives of your planning.
Yes, very much. In fact, as we read through all of the subcategories within the framework itself, one of the recommendations provided there is to consider cybersecurity risk in our already existing risk assessment functions. And what we realized as we read through that question is that while we perhaps address individual risks in an informal basis, we actually didn't have a comprehensive risk assessment policy or practice. And so we used the framework as a way of guiding how we changed our business operations through the institution of a risk assessment meeting. And what we felt like is that the outcomes of that risk assessment meeting would be very powerful for us in guiding the decisions that we would make as a business. So when we looked at our existing strategic planning process, we realized that the insertion of an overall risk assessment meeting at the front end of that would be of greatest value. So what we did is we started off with a risk assessment meeting. We covered cybersecurity risk, we covered human resources risk, we covered competition risk, everything that we could think of that keeps all of our department level folks awake at night. And we made sure that cybersecurity is included in the conversation. And then the actual outcome from that was that it led to our strategic planning process to make sure that strategically we addressed any of those risks. And then finally, as it moved into capital budgeting, we wanted to make sure that we were adequately addressing the dollars that we needed to both support our strategy and our greatest risks.
Well, and then when you take it down to the level of actually implementing it, when you had that conversation with the IT director, I mean, when I've looked at it, oh my gosh, I don't even think I could get through the framework. It's huge, right?
Yeah, it can be a little overwhelming. But one of the things that I mentioned to the director of our IT department is that if he was expecting from me that he would go through and complete a full assessment of this and come back with an answer or having it all completed within 2 weeks, a month, a year, that's probably unrealistic. And what I encouraged him to do is to not look at it as additional work. And it's one of the reasons why we are big proponents of maintaining this at a voluntary nature with individual adaptability as opposed to a regulated type framework. What I encouraged him to do is to use the framework to help him in doing the work that he's already doing. Just give some of that additional guidance to make sure that there's a cybersecurity element that's being addressed in all those regular functions. And when we started to realize that this could be a 3, 5, ongoing 3 to 5 year plan or an ongoing plan that just essentially is always just a fundamental shift in the way we do business, it became much more doable. And especially when we started looking at it saying, hey, look, the next time we meet, let's just talk about one subcategory. How are we doing on that? And then the next time we meet, we'll talk about one more. And 89 meetings may take a while, but at least we're doing one step at a time, and we believe it's making some meaningful progress.
Well, and one of the other things that's important about the assessment is scoring it and understanding where you are. So tell us a little bit about how you did that.
Sure. Well, the framework itself encourages you to go through an individual risk assessment in your organization on the basis of a target tier, i.e. your acceptable level of risk, and your current tier, basically where your current operations are. And an simplified example might be that I may have some adopted cybersecurity practices, but it's not documented, okay? So I may say, look, I'd probably be better off if I documented how I'm going to handle this. And so there's a gap that's there. And so we would assign what our current tier is, and we would assign what our target tier is, and then we give a numerical value to each, a simple 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we measure the gap between the two. And let's say our target tier was 3, tier level 3 is where we wanted to be. And currently we found ourselves as at a target 2. If you do the simple math, that's 66% of the way toward completion, right? Toward our acceptable level of risk. And we did that on every subcategory within the entire framework. And when you start adding up those 66% of 1, you end up with a final number value on a scale of 0 to 100. And the value of that really is just trying to peg a numerical value on where we're currently at, so that with each one of those subcategories, when I move from my current tier toward my target tier, then that percentage, whether it be 66 or anything else, starts becoming 1. And then on the complete basis of all the subcategories, once all of our current tiers have met our targets, then we feel like we're 100% toward our acceptable level of risk.
And interestingly, I guess as CFO you would do this, you compared it to bond risk, right?
Well, not exactly to bond risk. To clarify, what we tried to do is we knew that there was a number value between 0 and 100 that was possible with the way that I've calculated this. And when we looked at that, let's say the number came out to be 68, okay? So 68, is that good or bad? We didn't know. Mm-hmm. I knew if it changed, but I didn't know if it was good or bad comparative to what my overall acceptable level of risk is. And so I like to use the casual example, 68 is a good score in golf, but it's a bad score in basketball. And so we figured from 0 to 100, I can either make it a straight line distribution, and or I could use some type of a logarithmic chart that would show me how that distribution should look. We didn't feel like any of those were really very representative in terms of where we might be on the progress toward reaching our acceptable level of risk. And in the absence of any other risk distribution, we tried to come up with some creative ways of charting out what that risk pattern might look like. And when I started thinking, well, if there isn't a specific cybersecurity risk pattern that I could use, what would be a good proxy of risk? And sure enough, from my experience as a CFO, I recognized that interest rates have been used as a way of approximating or compensating for risk for hundreds of years. Yeah. And so my simple thought process was, if I took all of the bonds that have been out in the marketplace over the last 10 years and looked at the total number of bonds that was in a junk bond category versus all those that were in a AAA plus, and just counted the number of bonds in each, then what I figured, is, and it's not an academic study and it's not tied to cybersecurity risk in any way, but what I found was that the market rewards higher rated bonds differently than what they do junk bonds. And so the chart wasn't a straight line, it wasn't a logarithmic chart. The market responds better to sort of some categories versus others. And what I did as I looked at that is there's this line that is drawn between 0 and 100 that is distributed a little bit differently as a way of coming to a close approximation of risk. And then when I look at that line and I look at my score of 68, that gives me some relative context as to whether that 68 is moving closer, or if it's relatively close to my acceptable level of risk, or if at 68 is still really far off.
One of the things that you discussed was the importance of working with your vendors to understand what their approach is. Yeah,
and that's been something that's been of real value in the framework. I've always said that IT improvements aside, the biggest value in the framework for our organization has been conversations, whether it be within the IT department or between IT department and executive management. And most recently, it's been with external parties. We've began asking for some information from some of our larger vendors. We figured as a small business that perhaps we could benefit from the experience of others. And so we reached out to them to get some advice, and what we found is not everybody has documented policies and procedures in place. And so this year we've instituted a new practice internally. In addition to asking questions about the vendor and about the technical capabilities of their products, we've included as part of a questionnaire as to whether or not they're using the cybersecurity framework. And not all of them do, but it's opened up a dialogue to help us come to mutual understanding, or at least a mutual agreement of acceptable level of risk, and it's been very valuable.
Yeah, I could see it likened almost to the ISO process 20 years ago. It just becomes part of the culture, as you mentioned earlier. On the flip side, on your customer side, it's also been a competitive advantage, or you're using it that way, right?
Yeah, we believe it to be so. We know that companies that are nimble and responsive to risk, regardless of where that risk comes from, are going to be more benefit from that in the long term. So we try to do our best to stay in front of it. And we believe that in some ways, in fact, as we look at our own network design and the services that we provide for our customers, if we have a way of not exposing them to external networks, it actually improves the security posture of those services comparative to what somebody else might be able to offer. And so data storage is a big thing that's out there right now. Is there a different level of risk by storing data on net without going out into public internet versus, say, going to one of the other large providers? And you can think of like the Dropboxes and Google Drive and these other things where your data is going across public internet. There is a different level of cybersecurity risk that you expose yourselves to. And as we build our network and build services pertaining inside our network, we believe it to be a competitive advantage to talk about the security features that are there, and the customers are responding.
Well, I don't know if you want to comment on this last thing, but I thought it was a great analogy, your analogy of someone breaking into a store.
Sure. The reference is basically that the FCC as a governing body has a responsibility to ensure that there are appropriate consumer protections put in place. We understand that. And the reality is, as service providers, we have to accept that there will be some level of governance pertaining to that. And the governance is there, and it's designed to make sure that we as service providers are doing reasonable steps toward improving our cybersecurity posture. The reality is we're not 100%, there's no way you can be 100% secure. And so what you have to do is just minimize that risk as much as you possibly can. But at the end of the day, those people who are attacking our networks are criminals at best, and they are state acts of war at worst. And we believe that the government has a role not only just in governance, and there's a lot of talk about that right now, but the government also has a role in protecting life, liberty, and assets, the original charters of the Constitution. And what we would like to see, as for me personally, I believe for us as a business, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the industry, but generally it's felt that we would like to see some more involvement from government entities that is placing some more liability on those that are actually performing these criminal or state-sponsored acts. Because yes, in the example I gave, I might have a criminal who breaks into a Best Buy or some other supermarket and steals something, and there are laws that are there to punish that person, and whatever the consequence of that decision might be, it's designed to deter that type of activity. It would be ludicrous to have a governing body come into a department store and require that they use a different type of security monitor or a different type of security system as a way of protecting that company's assets. And that's what we're dealing with right now with the majority of the conversation on the governance side and not as much on the government protection side.
Excellent, Jeff. That's a great analogy, and it's great to catch up with you here.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.